Roberto Pasini, es la primera vez que está con nosotros. El tema que nos presenta es, su ponencia va a ser en inglés, entonces, pero él puede entender español si le hacemos las preguntas en español. Es la construcción de una ruta cultural en la Comunidad Europea a través del sureste de Europa. El caso de ATRIUM, un proyecto para convertir el patrimonio inconveniente de la arquitectura totalitarista en un proyecto territorial sustentable. Esa sería la propuesta que nos presenta Roberto. Roberto Pasini, su semblanza es arquitecto de tiempo completo en el Centro Garza Sada de Monterrey, de la Universidad de Monterrey, y director de la empresa AUS Pasini Reinery, acrónico del Servicio de Arquitectura y Urbanismo que ellos proporcionan. Su actividad profesional es activa en el campo de la arquitectura y el diseño territorial. Roberto se graduó con honores de la Universidad de Florencia y obtuvo su maestría en Harvard como becario Fulbright. En Harvard ha sido profesor y crítico de diseño en arquitectura, urbanismo y paisajismo. También ha impartido clases y dictado conferencias en varias instituciones en Europa, América y Asia. Entre 2006 y 2011 fue teniente de alcalde de urbanismo y las políticas ambientales de la Italia Central. En el 2004 al 2008 representó a Italia en el jurado de los premios de arquitectura H.C. Andersen de la Academia Nacional de San Luca, y en el 2011 el premio AI Toto de la American Institute of Architects. Bueno, pues muy bien, bienvenido Roberto, espero que esta primera participación sea la primera de muchas otras más. Bienvenido a nuestro seminario.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. First of all, it's an honor, and also I'm very curious to discover your city during the weekend. So there are two things that attract me a lot here. Well, I will tell you something about a project funded by the European Union to build what is called a cultural route in Southeast Europe. Well, first of all, a few considerations about a question: what is a cultural route? What is cultural heritage? How and when was it acknowledged and recognized at an international level among countries? So these are, I think, interesting questions, and I will try to give you a very fast cursory descriptions. The notion of cultural good has evolved its meaning, progressively broadening the semantic field associated with the hypernym heritage, extending it to include terms such as monument, site, cultural landscape, intangible heritage, and eventually cultural route. The cult of monuments, intended in modern sense as elements of a tangible heritage bequeathed from the past and encapsulating collective memory, can be traced back to the humanist Flavius Blundell in, let's say, mid of 15th century. In that time, he published his De Roma Instaurata, an encyclopedic guide in 3 volumes, reconstructing the topography of ancient Rome by means of philologically documenting its surviving ruins, drawing on classical literary sources and pioneering archaeological explorations. Since then on, investigations on the ruins of classical buildings of Rome have underarched the work of all the artists, architects, and intellectuals of humanism, Renaissance, Mannerism, and Baroque. Spanning from Alberti, De Re Edificatoria, to Palladio, 4 libri dell'architettura, the study of the surviving traces of antiquity was primarily aimed at rediscovering the rules of a sophisticated canon, which could instill its renovated harmony into current artistic practice. At the end of the 17th century, the young gentlemen from English upper class of means started the tradition of a long trip across France and Italy, aimed at an in-depth exposure to the legacy of classical antiquity, Renaissance, and fashionable society of the continent as well, which represented for them a personal initiation to aristocratic life. The trip, which would soon go under the name of Grand Tour, drawing wealthy young men, accompanied young ladies, and later young artists of any class from Northern European countries and eventually from Americas, fueled a renovated interest for the monumental heritage from the past and a new interest for sublime natural scenarios. The Italienische Reise, 1817 by Goethe, is one of the highest records of this phenomenon. Notes from his diaries, such as the following: "Naples is a paradise. Everyone lives in a sort of drunken oblivion of himself." A diary from 1787, when he took his Grand Tour, denote a deep involvement in the anthropological dimension of the environment. The same cultural sources would be able to feed then both romantic and neoclassical cultural production on the continent. Well, what you see here as a first image that I propose to you is Goethe, Wolfgang Goethe. He's in his Grand Tour. This is a painting by Wilhelm Tischbein, and he's sitting on a stone on the Via Appia Antiqua. Via Appia Antiqua was called the Regina Viarum. Well, it sort of recorded centuries and centuries of history, commerce, and military campaigns. It would run from Rome to Brindisi and connect Rome to Greece and the Orient. Well, we see here Goethe sitting on top and like surrounded by fragments from antiquity and works of art, but also on the background the Campagna Romana, this beautiful landscape. So in a way this this painting represents a very modern, a very contemporary concept of cultural heritage, art, monuments, but also landscape, and the sort of combined work by man and nature. Next picture is by Canaletto, mid of the 18th century. You see this gentleman walking around the ruins of Rome. Well, of course, you recognize the Colosseum and the Arch of Constantine, monuments, of course, but also another painting, the view of Vesuvius and the Gulf of Naples. So not only monuments, but also landscapes, inhabited landscapes. This is by Pietro Fabres. Although the archaeological fever which subsequently broke out, accompanying the excavations in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Sicily, Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt, and the British and German exploration of Near East maintained a prevalent antiquarian and predatory character, a wide, mature awareness had permeated the cultural elite worldwide, producing the modern elaboration by Viollet-le-Duc on restoration and by Morris and Raskin on conservation, as a response to the dramatic transformations produced by the Industrial Revolution. Well, if this sort of elitarian vision and concept and perception of the cultural heritage was already mature, it was not time yet for a sort of institutional and international recognition of the concept of heritage. in all its possible articulations. So let's see how a sort of short story of how that then evolved. The institutional recognition of the value of heritage on a transnational level followed with some substantial delay. Only in 1921, the League of Nations, descending from the tragic events of the First World War as an international body aimed at deactivating international conflicts, articulated a series of bodies, among which the International Museum Office and ONIMO's International Museum Office initiative, the Athens Charter for the Restoration of Monuments in 1931 was the first resolution to speak for 1. The creation of international advisory organization, 2. The creation of national legislations, 3. The establishment of custodial protection for historical sites, 4. Consideration for the surrounding areas, later integrated with 5. The concept of national protection authorities, and 6. Necessity of integrating historic buildings into town planning apparatus. It was the 17th General Conference of the UNESCO meeting like in Paris in 1972 to adopt the Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Cultural and Natural Heritage, recognizing the notion of natural heritage and eventually establishing a clear definition for cultural heritage, articulated in 3 subcategories: monuments, groups of buildings, and sites. The latter term is described as works of man or the combined works of nature and man of outstanding universal value from the historical, aesthetic, ethnological, or anthropological point of view. The World Heritage Committee was introducing the cultural landscapes into the broad semantic field of heritage, drawing on the elaborations by human geographers like Otto Scheuter and Karl Sauer, and their famous definitions. Culture is the agent, natural area is the medium, cultural landscape is the result. Since then, an international committee keeps up the World Heritage List, including so far 962 cultural and natural properties considered of outstanding universal value. The next step for UNESCO was then starting raising awareness also on intangible heritage beyond material manifestations, encompassing living expressions and traditions of groups and even orally inherited tradition from ancestors and transmitted to descendants. Well, of course, all this was promoted through a series of funded programs. As an international organization promoting cooperation among 51 countries of Europe in the areas of, among other, cultural cooperation, the Council of Europe has worked for the introduction of a new term into the evolving debate on the world heritage and its protection. Well, the European Institute of Cultural Routes was established with the intention of introducing the term of cultural route and of course establishing a body which could ensure development of the networks, assist for the management of the networks, promoting new initiatives, as well as compiling and maintaining the overall database. Well, this was the major contribution by a European institution to the enrichment and enlargement of the concept and the semantic area of cultural heritage or heritage in general. Well, the Way of St. James, or Camino de Santiago, the medieval pilgrimage route, which for centuries has drawn thousands across Europe to pay tribute to the mortal remains of the apostle St. James the Greater, buried in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, was the first entry to be declared a European cultural route in 1987, being included in the Atlas. The associated program provides for funds to restore, preserve, and maintain its paths and signposts, and develops slow-paced transnational mobility and consequent cultural exchange. The consideration of the route as a cultural heritage marks an evolutionary phase. Well, this is the cultural route of St. James Way. As you can see, it's not a straight itinerary, but it's a bundle. Yes, well, it's all that you see mapped in this picture is the route. So the route is a network, a bundle of itineraries. You can see how this route can be somehow recorded on the little booklet that each pilgrim, religious or like, whatever, one of the thousands who every year take the route, carries with them. Well, you can see you can see names of different towns and places where they have somehow visited. This is a sort of different representation of the same route, of the same bundle of itineraries. And well, as you can see here, the itinerary, the route is marked in very different ways, in different landscapes, in urban landscape and natural ones, like crossing rural areas, and is identified by the scallop shell, which used to be it was used by ancient pilgrims to drink from like fountains. And this is the terminal point, the city, the old town of Santiago de Compostela. Well, in 2008, UNESCO deliberated then its charter on cultural routes as World Heritage Properties, recognizing the new term with the following motivation. By respecting the intrinsic value of each individual element, the cultural route recognizes and emphasizes the value of all its elements as substantive parts of a whole. It also helps to illustrate the contemporary social conception of cultural heritage values as a resource for sustainable social and economic development. Well, this is the cathedral. This is the burial of St. James the Greater, the tomb dating back to the 9th century. And this is the sort of social and cultural, let's say, intangible heritage which is organized along this sort of material structure, which is actually the route. So we can, well, in other words, we can call it a pattern of integrity using Buckminster Fuller words, because it's a sort of material structure that organizing an ensemble of very heterogeneous and different things. The notion of cultural route, interpretable as a matrix putting in reciprocal play the spheres of monument, site, natural and anthropic landscape, cultural, tangible and intangible heritage, shifts the interest from the single item to a wider composite atmospheric environment. The cultural route represents the most substantial contribution from the Council of Europe and from Europe to the recent expansion of the semantic field surrounding the hypernym heritage and its institutional recognition. From an evocative perspective, the cultural route can be envisaged as the conceptual evolution of both the pilgrim journeys of the believers and the academic travels undertaken by scholars via the monasteries of Europe in the Middle Ages, as well as the Grand Tour of Monumenta e Mirabilia run by the young gentlemen to gain an understanding of the foundations of European culture. The program of the cultural routes was created at a time when Europe needed to reflect on the roots of its identity as the foundation for a shared citizenship. Since then, it has favored the identification of transnational itineraries as a means to promote protection, valorization, and transmission of Europe's cultural heritage as well as its cultural diversity. The routes are seen as platforms favoring intercultural dialogue and sources of possible economic development, cross-border trajectories promoting artistic, cultural, commercial, and political links, special tools for cultural initiative and exchanges of knowledge and ideas transcending the cultural and political barriers which had marked Europe during and after the great conflicts of the 20th century, as well as tools suitable for development and promotion of sustainable and ethical forms of tourism. May I ask you, going into the project itself, to run the video that I gave you.
He's coming.
I think he's coming because I gave him a video.
ATRIUM is a European project. ATRIUM stands for Architecture of Totalitarian Regimes in Urban Management. It's a project that the city of Forlì presented on a Southeast Europe programme with 18 partners in 11 different countries in Southeast Europe with a budget of around €2 million. It's a project which started in Forlì because Forlì has a peculiar characteristic. It's given that it was the city nearby which Mussolini was born, Mussolini decided to invest the city, make the city into a new city in the 1920s and 30s, and expanded eastwards, creating a whole new area of the city. So it's very much characterised by architecture of a high quality rationalist architecture. And this element of the city of Forlì is seen both in some senses as something to be proud of in terms of its architectural heritage, but also something to be a little bit distrustful of because it reminds us of the fascist heritage. That's why Forlì proposed itself as lead partner on this project, together with the province of Forlì-Cesena, because similar towns that had the same sort of heritage, Predappio near Forlì where Mussolini was born, Castrocaro, where the spa is a spa town, and Cesenatico on the sea in particular. Why have we done this project? What's the project meant to do? We've aimed at creating a cultural route, a European cultural route, around the theme of architecture of totalitarian regimes. ATRIUM stands for the Architecture of Totalitarian Regimes in Urban Management. So we've been putting side by side the architectural heritage of Italy, in Forlì in particular, with the architectural heritage in the Balkan area in particular, partly fascist architecture and partly also socialist architecture. And the idea is to create a tourist route around this particular architectural and critical historical heritage.
Okay. The Atlas of Cultural Routes of the European Council currently counts with 29 itineraries, including historical pilgrimage ways as well as thematic paths, such as the Route of the Olive Tree, which doesn't have anything to do with religion, interlacing communities around the Mediterranean basin. For the first time, the ATRIUM Project, acronym for Architecture of Totalitarian Regimes in Urban Management, applies the model of the cultural route to the architectural heritage from an inconvenient past, that of the totalitarian regimes which ruled large parts of Europe during the 20th century and which the present unequivocally repudiates. The exploration of a traumatic past through the material traces left in the urban landscape is proposed as a pathway leading to the reinvention of a possible future, converting a course into a chance, artifacts doomed to oblivion or demolition into opportunities for economic development in the frame of territorial management policies. This vision has been shared by 18 institutions spanning from ministries, universities, local administration to non-governmental organizations from 11 different countries of Europe: Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, Serbia, of Southeast Europe strategic area of the European Union, funding the project through its Regional Development Fund for a total of about $3 million US. Well, the lead partner is the municipality of Forlì. Well, you see all the partner listed here. It's a bit small, but University of Ljubljana, School of Architecture, Institute of Innovations and Sustainable Developments of Patras, Greece, National Institute of Immovable Cultural Heritage of Bulgaria, and others. Southeast Europe, not by chance, happens to be located on the borderline between the two blocks hegemonized by opposite totalitarian regimes of fascist and communist inspiration in the 20th century. And here you can see a map of the totalitarian regimes before Second World War and their distribution. And totalitarian regimes after Second World War, their distribution, and the sort of combination of the two. And as you can see, the boundary between the two major blocks runs right across southeastern Europe. In southeastern Europe, many cities and territories still bear tangible traces of the architectural heritage from totalitarian regimes of opposite signs. Albania and Croatia, for example, traversed by both fascist and communist regimes, show urban and architectural shells of large urban interventions and new foundation towns. Italy conserves material memories from its fascist past, as well as Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and others conserve those built in the communist area. Well, I will show you now, as an exemplification, like some images from Tirana, Albania, the capital of Albania. This is a picture from about 1900. Well, as you see, this is the main, let's say, plaza or open space in the center of the city, and as it was. And then the Italian fascist regime kicked in and started sort of grand urban schemes for the transformation of the city that you saw. This is a project by Brasini, dating 1926. This is then a master plan for the city by Bosio, a bit later, starting developing in 1938. And then this is the axis, the sort of monumental axis, planned and then built by the fascists, which shaped the central square of Skanderbeg. So you see how the same place has been transformed. And as you can see here, there is a sort of exedra of monumental buildings designed by Florestano di Fausto in 1928 until the 30s, which is still housing like important national institutions, including ministries of Albania. Well, then let's say communist regime kicked in and built other like representative buildings, like the Opera House that you see here, sort of continuing the monumental configuration of the space, which was configured, like materially configured only on the other side. And now the sort of democratic regime has reorchestrated the spaces of the square, as you can see from this image, even renovating all the fascist buildings. Well, what you can see in this square is architecture from like fascist period, fascist era, cohabitating with the ancient mosque, like which is probably the most ancient building still surviving in Tirana, the old clock from the 19th century, and the communist, let's say, architecture of the Opera House, and some recent buildings of the democratic capitalistic phase. Another building you can see here. And this is another building built by the communist regime, which somehow terminates the other exedra of the square. This is the National Museum with beautiful like artworks and ornamentation. So as you can see in the square, in the city, there is a sort of selection and collection of pieces from all ages and regimes, which somehow found the way to coexist and to be harmoniously orchestrated among them. Um, 71 case studies identified demonstrate that totalitarian regimes of different ideological orientation were able to produce a patrimony of sophisticated architecture in spite of ideas' ideological implications. Several pieces have already been separately studied by art and architectural critics and consequently rehabilitated in pure disciplinary terms, but still produce excruciating disputes about their possible adaptation to new function and a new role in the frame of the contemporary democratic city and society. The relevant heritage of totalitarian architecture of other countries, such as Germany and Poland, can be taken into consideration for further phases of the study, while an important patrimony and heritage from the, let's say, totalitarian period can be found in Germany and Poland, as a matter of fact. These are pictures from Prora. This is a huge sea bath establishment. It's several kilometers long with a monumental square right in the middle. This is, well, an old map. You can see the manufact here, the artifact. And this is a picture quite evocative from like the major the celebration plaza. And this is the building, how it looks like from one side. It's a sort of infinite. It tends to infinity. It's a sort of arithmetic entity, or whatever, algebraic, sorry.
The workers' palace. The workers' palace.
The workers' palace. Well, this is a building by Clemens Klotz, while the plaza was by Erich Putlitz, dating 35-39. This is the corridor inside. Well, you can see it's quite astonishing. And this is how it looks from like the other side. So, well, I don't know why it's sort of cut, but it's still sort of infinite, even looking at it from the other side. So, and this is how this kind of building, which is an inconvenient relic from the past, from a past that is repudiated by everybody, or almost, fortunately, can be reused, re-inhabited, and somehow re-donated to the democratic society. In a section of it, like a youth hostel and a series of hotels have been redeveloped and work well. The International Scientific Committee, oh well, this is another example, sorry. Wustrov by Heinrich Tessenov, 1933, another sort of sea bath establishment, but also originally the Flankschule, which was the sort of anti-aerial incursion school, so a military school. Project by Tessenov, very poetic and evocative location. Buildings are running down, so. it's a patrimony that can be sort of rehabilitated. And on top of it, the sort of Soviet army has left its trace after the Nazis. So it has already been re-inhabited and reinvented by the Soviet army, which made of it a port for its navy. And it can be re-inhabited again because buildings are shells and they can be re-inhabited, reinvented in spite of their ideological ideas, ideological, let's say, origin. Beautiful spaces that can be work as a sort of tourist facility or tourist resort place. The International Scientific Committee, which coordinated the proposal on behalf of the project partners, set out the guidelines aiming at the two major objectives of deploying a self-liberating cultural debate and second, exploring the ways of a possible economic valorization of their neglected architectural heritage from totalitarian regimes. The thematic transnational cultural route is expected to become a source of diffuse and sustainable local development oriented to the service of cultural tourism, including the cultural heritage into the sustainable development policies of the territory. The lead partner of the project, the city of Forlì and its territory, are disseminated with the relevant heritage of rational architecture from the 20s and 30s. And it has been challenging engagement on this controversial theme since about a decade on local, national, and international level. Scientific research, studies, publication, diffuse formal and informal debate with socio-political implications have finally collapsed into the critical mass and consolidated the articulated transnational network which allowed for this project to take off. What I'm showing here is another fascist plan for the city of Forlì, devising another monumental axis. On this side you will see a building that I will show now, the fascist Italian youth house, designed by Cesare Valli, a sophisticated and a wonderful Roman architect who was working for the fascists. Of course, this is ideas and it has to be condemned, but still the architecture which remains to us is this building. Here you see it as it was built in 1935. It's a beautiful example of Italian rationalism, drawing on classical canon. Well, it also relates to the sort of major enterprises of Italian architecture, like the Casa Gil di Trastevere in Roma by Luigi Moretti. You can see there are clear, let's say, correspondences and similarities, analogies between the two projects, like the tower, organizing the architectural composition of volumes of linear and curvilinear. Well, you see it here behind, this very, very sophisticated architecture, which is a masterpiece of Italian architecture. You can see like just how advanced was the architectural technique, allowing for a swimming pool to be placed within the building and to be liberated for a side, like from a sidewalk, just opening a sliding glazed facade, which was very advanced for the time. And these other buildings, again reminding to these beautiful examples of the highest achievements of Italian rationalism. And this is how it was left for decades until a few years ago, when the municipality of Forlì started the renovation of it. Well, I will tell you a little story. Now it looks like this. I will tell you a little story about the top of the tower. You see, these beautiful details were redone in terracina plaster, wonderful and sophisticated, and beautiful travertine marbles and details. Well, what you can see here is, well, on top of the tower, there was an hideous oath due by the young fascists to Mussolini. Well, after the Second World War, the partisans took the letters off, and such remained for a long time. Well, during the renovation of the building, there was a huge debate within Forlì, a very harsh debate, because there were like people who were intellectuals who were supporting the thesis that renovating the building, even the lettering, should have been sort of reconstructed to as a testimony, as a witness of an historical fact and an historical period. Some other were saying that probably the plaster should have covered everything, cancelling any memory of this hideous statement. Well, I personally took part in the debate, and I proposed to reconstruct the lettering, but with organizing, stating a very different sentence, saying that that building had been built during the fascist time, but that democratic institution and society is stronger enough to rehabilitate the same building, reconstruct it, but to endow it to much higher democratic functions. Well, this didn't go through. It was a sort of the sort of final decision was that of a very, let's say, equilibrated decision, that of renovating everything except for this square, let's say, rectangle, in which they would keep both the trace of the lettering and the trace of the removal of it, so that it was a sort of record of history. Well, the building is very beautiful, and now it will be put to the service of the democratic society. It will probably be the seat, the headquarters of the cultural route of ATRIUM. Well, a joint secretariat, how it was built, the project of the cultural route, I'm almost at the end. A joint secretariat was set up in charge for financial management, human resources, and technical equipment for the project. The management structure is based on a steering committee which makes top-level decisions and assesses the progress through periodical cross-border meetings assisted by a scientific committee. The lead partner implements the decision of the steering committee. Work packages are assigned to different partners in charge of the production of specific planned outputs under the general coordination of the lead partner. A communication and dissemination strategy has been aimed at involving local, national, and international agencies and general public, specifically articulated for policymakers, stakeholders, tourist operators, scholars, civil servants of local institutions, local small and medium enterprises, media experts, and social actors, raising awareness on the project outputs and potential. The target groups belong to various spheres and activities, spanning from urban planning, construction, tourist industries, heritage management, research and education, community operators. The third work package compiled by the National Institute of Immovable Cultural Heritage of Bulgaria consists in the identification of the urban planning and architectural case studies representing the material heritage on the national territories of the partners. For each case, collection of specific historic documentation, specific analysis of present state, specific analysis of the underlying notion associated to the duality city-power, and then subsequent compared analysis and organization of of an archival according to thematic and typologic or otherwise coherent categories. The set of criteria for the selection of the case studies and the template for the selection of the collection of the information were devised under the guidance of the scientific committee. Well, you see here the result of the third part, which is the Transnational Survey. You can see here the territories and, architecture reviews, comparing different schemes across the territories. We will not talk much about each one of them. You see how it is a compared sort of anatomy, sort of comparable to the Cuvier's compared anatomy for naturalists. Anyway, schemes are sort of compared. You can see here, it's a huge documentation. Of different typologies, public buildings, residential buildings, buildings done for authoritarian and totalitarian institutions, or done by the totalitarian institution for a sort of social, let's say, welfare that we're trying to anyway introduce. Well, this is a very, just on this one we can just spend 2 words. The comparison between these 2 buildings, the one that we have seen before, the Casa del Fascio di Forlì, which was the sort of seat of the young fascists of Forlì, and this is the seat of the Communist Party in Staribor. You see, it's a very different architectural composition, denoting a very different approach. And here we can compare the two plans, this one and the other one. The first one relating to a sort of ponderal symmetry and harmony, and going back to the sort of roots of classical architecture. The other one a sort of very functional distribution, sort of organizing the functions in the most efficient way, although very, very interesting and attractive. Well, we just go ahead with these examples. Each one is sort of wonderful and fascinating, like a comparison of monuments, real monuments, which are probably the least interesting and least reusable. So the concept of monument has evolved in such a way that the monument is at the bottom of the list of the interest, let's say, for me at least. And then a series of graphs trying to investigate the potential for economic reuse and development. It's a very thorough analysis. And here, the sort of mapping of all the case studies across the territory, and ways in which they can be grouped and subgrouped to organize the bundle of itineraries of the final route. So there will be itineraries, alternative itineraries, and sub-itineraries in the final bundle of the cultural route. Okay, and this is also an analysis of how the sort of ideological influence and, let's say, had expanded across the territory. And this one is a proposal, a final, well, not a final, a sort of phase, of in the definition of the bundle of itineraries across the territory and within the framework of the other cultural routes of Europe. Another phase, I will be very fast, I'm to the end. implied the production of a transnational manual of good practice for the restoration and conservation, as well as for the wise reuse, management, and economic valorization of the identified controversial heritage, which will also entail a program of discussion forums open to any local stakeholders playing a role in the development of territory, and the program of training seminars addressed to policymakers, public officials, and professionals. The manual is also meant to be the base for possible further research in historical, sociological, architectural, and tangible and intangible cultural manifestations. Well, this is the manual, just a brief cursory look through it. It's a manual of good practice of restoration and reuse and valorization. So again, graphs, economical analysis, meta projects, and that's it. I think I was clear enough on this point. This is a big exhibition on art from that period that is being organized by the beautiful Museum of San Domenico in Forlì, and draws masterpieces from arts like art of Movimento Novecento, and is an example of this possible, let's say, manifestation. Well, one of the aims of the project is without doubt academic, that of locating such an architectural production which remains relevant in mere disciplinary sense, in spite of a clear ideological reputation, into the vast panopticon of more and less democratic and utopian urban vision of the 20th century. And here we see Eur 42 in Rome, which is an example of this fascist architecture, but we see also Ivan Leonidov plan for Magnitogorsk, and Ville Radieuse by Le Corbusier, and Hilbersheimer high-rise city, and again Hilbersheimer working for the capitalists in Chicago, developing a plan for Chicago. But the construction of an open archival of European totalitarian architecture, where each piece is catalogued according to the guidelines of detailed analytical templates, allowing for comparative analysis, typological, functional, perspective, grouping and subgrouping, and projection of potential, retraceable in a cultural route branching across the continent, is ultimately aimed at tearing a pan-European heritage from a collective, tragic memory of history, to be redeemed in the delivery of a future territorial vision for the people. The fundamental challenge that the renovated institutions of this country are still facing is on what basis is it possible to culturally and civically exorcise a disquieting past in order to reinvent a vision for the reuse of its material remains and possibly explore their possible economical profit to the benefit and edification of the contemporary democratic societies. And this was my last picture.
Bien, bueno, me parece que este concepto de las rutas culturales que Roberto Pasini nos ha presentado como una nueva concepto y estrategia para la conservación del patrimonio, viendo la red europea que ya se ha venido configurando con esta identificación del concepto, pues me parece que es inquietante para nosotros en América Latina, en América en general, pues para poder, yo pensaría, seguir esos pasos y poder establecer una red panamericana, no paneuropea, sino panamericana, de rutas culturales. El caso que nos presentó esta mañana Francisco Bedregal, pues da pie a una ruta cultural panamericana. Tú señalabas la ruta del Inca, que prácticamente corre el continente desde el Ecuador hasta la Argentina. Entonces, si sin duda en esa ruta, que tiene un fin de todo un imperio prehispánico, pues habrá una serie de elementos urbanísticos y arquitectónicos a lo largo de ella que podrían ser motivo para un turismo cultural, pero también para una integración entre países, establecer vínculos de diferentes tipos. Y también la presentación que nos hizo Carlos Bell sobre esta preocupación por rescatar un momento en la historia de la arquitectura y del urbanismo de la ciudad de Barranquilla, pues creo que con los temas de la arquitectura totalitaria y fascista, que tendrían un mal estigma, pues como dice Robert, las sociedades democráticas maduras deben de ser tolerantes y aceptar que son hechos, huellas de un momento de la historia y que no se puede ignorar. Entonces me parece que esa reflexión pues a mí me provoca que tenemos que seguir. Hay una nueva línea de trabajo para los arquitectos urbanistas y bueno, que no depende de nosotros exclusivamente, pero algo tenemos que hacer en el contexto en el que actuamos.